Welcome to This Complex Life, a podcast dedicated to exploring the beautiful mess of life and relationships. I'm your host, Marie Vakakis, therapist, mental health and relationship educator. Coming to you from the lands of the Bunurong and Wurundjeri people, join me as we navigate life's messiness and complexities one conversation at a time. This episode is another episode as part of a series that I've been doing on the topic of men's health. June was Men's Health Month, and I've actually got more episodes than weeks of June, so this will go a little bit over into July. But this guest I'm really excited about. He combines his experiences as a clinical psychologist, academic, researcher, author. He's got an amazing resume with his lived experiences.
So despite being known as Dr. Happy, I've been very unhappy for much of my life. I've had quite multiple significant episodes of major depressive disorder, anxiety, suicidal ideation and self-harm. And I didn't talk about that for a long time, largely because no one did back in those days.
Like many guests in this series, he uses his own story to highlight the importance of sharing experiences and normalizing and destigmatizing conversations about mental health and letting people know when we struggle.
There just weren't enough men particularly talking about it, sharing their experience. And we know from the research that that's vitally important. We know that sharing experiences does smash stigma. Smashing stigma increases the chances that people will seek help. If people then seek help, they can get better a lot more quickly. They suffer a lot less.
We also have a bit of a chat about some of the myths and misconceptions around happiness and when happiness serves us well, what are the pros and cons of being happy, and how we can build up our happiness muscle, just like we would working out at the gym and building up our strength.
Absolutely no doubt that healthy versions of positivity or happiness are good for us. Happiness isn't just feeling good. It's also about people who are genuinely happy do more good. They're more altruistic, they're more generous, they're more successful in the workplace. But it's also good for our health and well-being. So if we're psychologically healthy, we tend to be more physically healthy. It's good for our relationships. So genuine, authentic versions of happiness and positivity are genuinely good for us.
We also talk about some tips on how to approach someone you're worried about.
Seek first to understand, then to be understood, and then maybe, if the person wants, work towards solutions with them.
So why talk about this? Mental health issues are common, and men's mental health is a critical issue that often doesn't get enough attention. The statistics are not looking so good. Men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women, accounting for at least 75% of all suicides in Australia. And about 1 in 8 men will experience depression, and about 1 in 5 will experience anxiety at some point in their life. We also know, and I've seen this in some of the people I work with, that men are less likely to visit a doctor for regular checkups compared to women, and often only seek medical help and psychological help as well when things are seriously really bad. So it means they miss out on early detection and prevention opportunities. So over the last few weeks, and the next few episodes will be on this theme as well, I've been on a journey with my guests. I've been interviewing various professionals, all men, to help me understand and to help listeners understand a bit about why men can find it difficult to seek support, talking about men's mental health, shame, stigma, anxiety, depression, and a range of different things. My guests and I will be discussing challenges men face, and in particular today, Tim will talk about some of the myths and misconceptions around mental health and some practical strategies to improve your own mental health and to inquire about someone that you're worried about. To help me understand a little bit more about men's health, today I have Dr. Tim Sharp, also known as Dr. Happy, and he's a well-known positive psychologist and the founder of the Happiness Institute. He has dedicated his life to promoting happiness and well-being, and he has a wealth of knowledge to share. This is a jam-packed episode. We'll talk about some practical strategies to improve your mental health, common myths about happiness and how to address them, the importance of being open about mental health struggles, and some of the things to say and maybe to avoid when asking a friend or family member if they're okay. Hello and welcome to another episode of This Complex Life. Today we are keeping up with our series on men's mental health for Men's Health Month, and I have with me Tim, also known as Dr. Happy. So Tim, could you share with the audience a little bit about your background, who you are and how you got the nickname Dr. Happy?
Well, firstly, thanks for having me. Great to be here. I'll give you the short, and then if you want me to elaborate on it, we can go back and go into a bit more detail. The simple answer is my background, my early professional background was as a clinical academic. So I did my clinical master's degree and became a therapist, then did a PhD, and I guess was known as a clinical academic. So I was a therapist, lecturer, and researcher for the first sort of part of my career, which was wonderful. At that stage, that was my dream, and I was living the dream job in a fantastic team, in a fantastic unit, doing really fulfilling, satisfying work. But then had a bit of, I guess, an epiphany for a range of reasons, surprised everyone, including myself, and left this dream job and went into private practice, which is not something I'd ever really considered, well, not something I considered at all up until that time. And I didn't really think it was going to become a permanent move. I thought it was going to be a sort of a waypoint maybe. One thing led to another, and that then became a very successful private practice. It grew into, I was employing 40 or 50 people. We had multiple offices. So what went from quite a successful clinical academic career became quite a successful entrepreneurial private practice career. And then I had another epiphany where I realized that I didn't actually really want to be a businessman running which had sort of happened accidentally. And I was spending all of my time, running the business and not really doing what I enjoy doing. And around that time, coming back to part of your question, were the very early seeds, I suppose, of what came to be known as positive psychology. So I got really excited about this and started to shift my attention away from more traditional clinical psychology to positive psychology. And that's when I established the Happiness Institute. And along the way was given the nickname, I suppose, by a friend and colleague, Dr. Happy, which I didn't really take seriously to begin with. In fact, I was quite resistant for quite a while. I didn't really think anyone would take me seriously, and I didn't really take it that seriously. But I did actually realize he sort of kept joking with me about it. And we both sort of realized quite quickly that it was an attention grabber. It was a conversation starter. And so although reluctantly initially, I started to more actively use it as a way to start conversations and I suppose to get attention for topics and issues that I thought were important. And so that was the next stage of my career was the Happiness Institute, promoting the principles of positive psychology and focusing mainly on happiness in the workplace, positive culture, etc. And along the way came some writing and PR and media work, and I guess that's a simple or short version of sort of how I've got to where I am today, I suppose.
What's one thing we get wrong about happiness?
Oh, there's lots of things. And it's a really good question because I talk a lot about happiness and write a lot about happiness, but I spend a lot of that time busting myths and misconceptions. So I might I'll focus on some of the big, more common ones. And probably the most common one is, there's a couple of ones, I suppose. One of the more common ones is that happiness is just something that should come to us or something that should come easily to us. Now, there are some people out there, and I'm sure some of you are listening, wake up in the morning and find happiness comes easily. There are some people that are just kind of born naturally more predisposed to optimism and gratitude and happiness. And look, if you're one of those people, good luck to you. It's a fantastic thing to be. But for many of us, it doesn't necessarily come naturally or easy. For many of us, it can be quite difficult, I suppose. But the good news is we can work on these things. There are skills that we can learn and skills that we can master. And if we do these things, just like we can build our physical strength by going to the gym, I suppose, we can also build our psychological strength and be happier. So that's one of the myths, I suppose, is that it's just something that should just happen. Whereas the reality is for many of us, we've got to work at it. One of the other really common myths is that we can or should be happy all the time. And that's patently absurd. For men, it's really not true. The reality is that happiness will come and go, just like other emotions will come and go. Life will throw curveballs at us. There'll be ups and downs, failings and fallings and stumbles and that's all part of it. And I suppose that's a big part of my new book, I suppose, about Lost and Found, that we need to accept those imperfections, those failures, those mistakes that we're all going to make at times, and we need to accept that along with that will come stress, anxiety, worry, anger, frustration, sadness, etc., etc., etc. So they're probably two of the bigger myths. There are lots of other ones within there as well, but maybe I'll leave it at that for now unless you want to go into more detail.
When we think about men's mental health in particular, how does this idea of maybe being happy all the time work against men in particular? I mean, it's probably a bit of both. All gender, I guess, would be impacted by this. But I think there are some either cultural differences, in particular for men, that might make this have a different impact. This idea of having to be happy all the time or being expected to. How do you see that play out either in your academic work or clinical work?
And a really interesting one. Again, I mean, the big issue of whether we should be happy all the time or even what happiness means will affect everyone, regardless of gender to some extent. Because even, whether it's men, women, or whatever, I mean, happiness will mean different things for different people. It will look different for different people. So your version of happiness may probably will be different to mine, as it should be. You're a different person with different background and different aspirations. So at an individual level, we all need to, I suppose, define our own happiness. What does happiness mean for us, and then work towards creating that as best we can. But to come back to your question, which is a great one, really, because there are some cultural differences and there are some gender differences. And maybe just to go off on a slight tangent for now, there's a lot of debate at the moment about how depression, for example, represents or looks or can present differently for men than women. And in fact, a lot of the criteria we use in traditional clinical settings to define or diagnose depression do tend to be more the sorts of things that the people who are identified as female might present with. And what some people are arguing is that I'm always a little bit reluctant to discuss it because by definition we're overgeneralizing here. But if we just accept that caveat, what we do often see is that for men, depression can look quite different, and it can present more in terms of anger or aggression, or it can present more in other ways, even withdrawal. So yeah, we do need to be aware of that, or anyone that works in this area does need to be conscious of the fact that depression can look very different for different, as can the other emotions as well. So.
Yeah, it's definitely something I noticed in particular working with younger men and working in schools, that the response would be different if you saw someone presenting with symptoms of depression from that really sad kind of maybe teary or sort of more a different emotional expression. But whereas boys, if they were irritable or cranky, it was seen as aggressive or something to be punitive and punished. So the response they got at a time of need was actually very different as well.
Yeah, sure. Again, when you talk about those, I guess the classic symptoms of depression or sadness, of teariness, and they're typically more associated with sort of feminine responses, I suppose, or female, rightly. So we do need to be wary, looking out for other related type responses that young men or older men, for that matter, might engage in if they're experiencing depression. And I suppose to come back to the other part of your question, the same can be said for happiness. There are typical versions of happiness that might be more associated as being, or might be more seen as being, sort of female versus men. And and again, I think it all comes back to understanding, what does it really mean for me as an individual? What does my happiness look like? And look, none of them are right or wrong necessarily, but ultimately we all need to find our own healthy version that works for us.
Mm. Is there this idea of having to be happy or striving to be happy? Do you ever see it have an impact on how people respond to their friends' levels of distress? Maybe they comment saying you should just whatever, or think of the positive. Like, do you ever notice that perhaps for some people it dismisses more difficult experiences or emotions under this sort of like, well, just don't think about it, just be happy, or be grateful for what you've got?
Oh, for sure. There's, I suppose that touches on or relates to a concept I'm sure you're familiar with, and maybe some of the listeners are familiar with, called toxic positivity. I suppose the sort of unrelenting, excessive, or unrealistic versions of positivity, which we know are they can be quite dangerous and damaging for ourselves, but also, as you've hinted at, if we respond to other people in a way that might be dismissive. So let me go back. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that healthy versions of positivity or happiness are good for us. Happiness isn't just feeling good. It's also about people who are genuinely happy do more good. They're more altruistic. They're more generous. They're more successful in the workplace. But it's also good for our health and well-being. So if we're psychologically healthy, we tend to be more physically healthy. It's good for our relationships. So genuine, authentic versions of happiness and positivity are genuinely good for us. But what you hinted at in your question, those sort of toxic or unrealistic versions, are not necessarily, and they're not good for us. So, if I tell myself I should be positive all the time, well, that's not going to recognize or appreciate the times when I'm not. And in fact, I'm just going to then be more upset with myself. So, for example, if I'm having a bad day, which I do, obviously, if I'm feeling upset, if I then put another layer on top of that saying, well, you're an idiot, you're hopeless, you're stupid for not being happy, that just adds more and more layers of distress on top of the original problem to begin with. And we can do that to other people as well. So, if you were having a bad day and I said to you, just pull up your socks, just get on with it, just brighten up. That's really not recognizing the experience that you're having, the emotional experience that you're going through at the moment. And that dismissiveness can be quite insulting. It can be quite offensive. It can be quite unhelpful. One of the positive solutions to that, and one of the I have a love-hate relationship with social media in this area, I suppose, but there's a lot of good things. One of the good things is the sort of the hashtag, I suppose, we've seen in recent years called "It's okay not to be okay." And the reason I sort of don't always like those things is that they, by definition, oversimplify, and that is an oversimplification, but it's a bloody good one. So that's one of the better ones, I think, because it's such a simple but important message. Of course, it's okay not to be okay. And we need to sometimes say that to our friends and colleagues and loved ones and family members. You don't need to brighten up all the time. You don't need to chirp up and pull it. It's okay not to be okay. It's okay to be sad or angry or whatever you're going through. But we obviously don't want that to be overwhelming. So, yes, it's okay to be okay. We need to accept that. But look, as soon as possible, let's try to do something about this. Let's try to move on. I suppose, I'm sure you're familiar with, and the listeners are familiar with, one of the more contemporary approaches to therapy called acceptance commitment therapy. And, that balance between acceptance on the one hand, but commitment to positive action is what we want to strive towards, I suppose, and help other people strive towards.
Yeah, you mentioned that over the toxic positivity can be quite dismissive. What impact does that have relationally? So not just, couples, father, child, it could be mates. What's the impact of if someone's trying to kind of maybe hint or kind of sprinkle into the conversation that they're not okay, and you come at it with one bit that they're trying to fix it, which let's not get into that right now, but there's like, oh, you should just be okay or be grateful for that, or the pull up your socks. What impact that does that have on a relationship?
Yeah, look, another great one. And look, it's going to depend on the person and the relationship. Obviously, we all interpret these things in different ways. But if that happens to me, which has happened in the past, well, I suppose one thing is, depending on who it was, more often than not, I guess I would assume that they're trying to help. Most people don't do that. They're not being malicious or nasty in any sort of way. So, even though I wouldn't necessarily see it as an ideal response, I would try to understand that person probably is doing the best they can, I guess. But putting that aside, if someone does say to me, oh, come on, just chirp up or just get on with things, I guess what they're saying is that they don't really understand me. They don't really understand my experience, that they're not really empathizing or being supportive in a genuine, authentic way. And so I suppose to me, I would maybe question the nature of that relationship. Do they really care? Are they really listening? Now, again, I think more often than not, it's not that they don't care. It's that they don't necessarily have the knowledge or skills to have these conversations. That's a whole other issue. I suppose it comes back to the point I made earlier about that kind of love-hate relationship. Another, as well as it's okay not to be okay, but one of the other ones, that people, well, I'm sure you have too, that people like us have, we've promoted for many, many times for many, many years now, is it's okay to reach out and ask for help. And that's super important. Of course, it's okay to reach out and ask for help. We all need help sometimes. But part of the problem with that is that if I reach out and ask for help, many of the people won't know how to give me that help, or they won't know how to respond. So until we train people essentially, and I don't mean psychologists and health professionals, until we train the average person out there to respond helpfully and appropriately, then reaching out and asking for help could actually, can backfire sometimes, because if you don't get the right response, that can actually be a bit unpleasant and be unfortunate in many ways. So yeah, there are many layers to that. As I said, I think most people are trying to do the best they can, but again, it's also sending that message. If they respond in the way we talked about earlier, it's kind of sending a message saying, well, either I don't really understand you or I don't really care. Although I don't think that's necessarily true a lot of the time.
Yeah, but I can see how that can feel that way, especially when I work with couples a lot, with young adults, and when they talk about their parents, it's really hard to trust someone's got your best intentions in mind when you feel like they don't understand you. And dismissing something that easily can feel like, well, you haven't understood me. You haven't understood the whole thing I'm worried about. How could you possibly have my best interests at heart when it's clear to me, rightly or wrongly, that you don't get it?
Yeah, and look, as I said earlier, I mean, you very briefly touched on another point about that idea that sometimes people just want to fix them, and that's as a parent must, that's a really common reaction. If we see our kids, distressed or going through any sort of difficult period, as a parent, we obviously don't want that. We want our kids to be happy. We want them to be healthy. We want them to be successful, however you define that. So as a parent, it's very easy to sort of jump into that fixing, which is not completely irrational, but it's not always helpful, particularly in the first instance, because as I said, we want to show our children that we understand, that we want to listen to them. And sometimes, not everyone who's upset wants to be fixed or wants people to fix them. So yeah, whether you're a parent or a friend or a colleague, the principle's pretty much the same sort of thing. I guess, seek first to understand, then to be understood, and then maybe if the person wants, work towards solutions with them.
Yeah, I love that, seek to understand. That's one of the things I talk about a lot is connection first. And then there's all these other things first. So seeking to understand is probably a big part of that. If we think about, I mean, there's a few themes that have been popping up in my conversations for Men's Health Month. And a lot of them, when it comes to seeking help or mental health, there's a lot of things are floating around shame and stigma. How do you bring that into your work? So in some of your talks and in various podcasts, you talk a lot about your own journey, which is very brave, but also I imagine very destigmatizing for a lot of people to hear someone who is not only a professional, but maybe looks like them or sounds like them or the same gender, like sharing some more vulnerable bits. How do you kind of understand that whole shame and stigma and help seeking in your space and in the circles you move through?
Yeah, look, that's been a big part of my life for the last decade. I guess to go back to the beginning, for those who aren't familiar, I guess many people won't be familiar. I've experienced mental ill health, so despite being known as Dr. Happy, I've been very unhappy for much of my life. I've had quite multiple significant episodes of major depressive disorder, anxiety, suicidal ideation, and self-harm. And I didn't talk about that for a long time, largely because no one did back in those days. And also, I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't know how to talk, or I didn't even know you could talk about it, I suppose, back in the days. It just wasn't done, when I was younger. In fact, it was actively hidden. It was seen as shameful and embarrassing and a failure and weakness, etc., etc. So, for much of my earlier life, I didn't ever talk about it for multiple reasons, and then started to more and more, again, approximately, I can't remember exactly when, approximately a decade or so ago, as we started to see this movement, Are You OK Day and beyond, the work Beyond Blue, and particularly, Batir, a youth mental health organisation that I've been very involved in for many years. And I didn't do that because I necessarily want to. I'm quite a private person, and I don't, there's a lot about my life I don't share. But I did do it for those exact reasons that at that stage, there's more now, but at that stage, there just weren't enough men, particularly, talking about it, sharing their experiences. And we know from the research that that's vitally important. We know that sharing experiences does smash stigma. Smashing stigma increases the chances that people will seek help. If people then seek help, they can get better a lot more quickly. They suffer a lot less. So I guess I started to do it because I was encouraging other people to do it, and I thought, well, I need to walk the talk, or whatever it's called. And also, I guess I just wanted to be a bit of an example for my kids. I wanted at that stage, my kids would get into that age when, I didn't want to hide it from them anymore. I thought it was important that they knew that, you didn't have to be perfect all the time. You didn't have to be happy all the time. So there were multiple reasons. And now I do talk openly. And this latest book is part memoir. So I share, this is the most personal book I've ever written, sharing more details about my lived experience of mental health, particularly, and other aspects of my life as well. But I think, again, particularly particularly, I guess, of a certain age, it just wasn't done for so long, and it was problematic, because the more we hide these things, the more the shame grows, and the more we let them out, the more we can actually feel, look, there's nothing to be, I'm not embarrassed to have to see an optometrist and get glasses to fix my eyesight. I'm not embarrassed to see, a doctor for something else, or a mechanic if my car's broken. Why should I be embarrassed because I'm, psychologically not perfect? I mean, none of us are. So yeah, I suppose talking about it is a way of maybe helping a few other people out there realize that, again, it's okay not to be okay, and it's okay to get help.
Yeah, I think that's so powerful. And the more people that share their journeys and use their platform or their reach to promote open conversations, I think is so beneficial. The episode before you with Shannon Malloy, he was sharing his experiences of childhood sexual assault and the help-seeking behavior after that, and interviewing different people. And he was sort of sharing similar things of like, well, the more we talk about it, the more other people can talk about it. And the response from listeners of his audiobook or readers, so, they might have the first person that they've come across that feels relatable, that has spoken about something that sometimes feels unspeakable.
Well, 100%. And the other part, I experienced this, and I think a lot of people do. Again, when I was younger and first some really bad episodes, on top of all of the distress, and it was incredibly dark and difficult times. And on top of all of that, I thought I was the only one. And it seems absurd now, but I just thought no one else has been like this. No one else would understand this, which is again absurd because millions of people experience it every day. But back in those days when we didn't talk about it, you felt more, and then feeling more alone is just again adds to the problem. It just makes it even harder to over. So there are many reasons why I think it's beneficial to share stories, but one of them is that hopefully some other people out there, and hopefully some younger people, because I say that because then they don't have to go through years and years before they get help, but hopefully other people out there is that they're not. In fact, it's incredibly common. A significant number of people at some stage in their lives will experience mental ill health, will experience suicidal ideation, will experience self-harm, all of these sorts of things, etc., etc. And realizing that we're not alone makes it just a little bit easier to reach out and ask for help, because I can then say, well, I know I'm not alone, and I know, well, other people have got help, other people have got better, maybe I can too.
Yeah. So for people listening, if they're listening to this and they're thinking, okay, so how I respond is also really important, without kind of giving them a full sort of incidental counselor training or mental health first aid, maybe can you give me 2 or 3 things that somebody should not do, and then maybe a couple of ways that they can respond if somebody close to them hints at or starts to share that they're not doing okay? What should we avoid?
Well, I might just before I get to that, point people to there's some great resources online. There's some pretty crap resources online, so you need to be careful. There, again, there's a bit of a warning about where you go to advice, but I will actually point people to the Are You OK Day website, and I've got no affiliation with them. So, but they've done some fantastic work over the years. People are probably familiar with Are You OK Day, but they might not be familiar with the website. And the website has some absolutely fantastic resources, including tip sheets and videos about how to respond when people say they're not okay. So there's some great videos that really walk through step by step about how to ask that question and then how to respond. Because again, Are You OK Day has been fantastic about promoting that question. But a lot of people are still afraid because I think, well, if I ask you and you say, well, no, I'm not okay, well, God, what am I going to do then? And that's understandable. So yeah, I would direct people to that. There's a lot more to the website than just that question. Some really, really good resources, and Beyond Blue has some great resources as well. I think Black Dog Institute, all of those, some really good institutions and organisations that have some great resources. But I suppose to come back to your question again, I think so. Remember, you don't have to be an expert. You don't have to be a qualified psychologist. You don't even have to get all your words or your questions or your sentences right. Just show you care. Just show that you want to be there, that you can be there, just to sit with them. So, this is one thing people are afraid of. Well, what if Maria says she's not okay? Well, I don't know how to fix her. You don't have to fix her. You don't have to have the answers. There are professionals who do that, hopefully. So, it's not about having all the answers or having all the solutions or knowing everything about mental health or whatever. It's really just being about a genuine, caring human who's prepared to sit with another human who might be going through a difficult period. And that might be a bit uncomfortable, but it's very valuable as well. So, just try to understand, just try to be there. At best, if that person really does need professional help and you're not qualified to do it, try to get them to the GP, try to get them to a qualified professional, or maybe get them to one of those good websites. As I said, there's some great resources and tip sheets. That might not be enough for everyone who's going through really severe circumstances, but it's a good start point to some of those tip sheets or information about how to overcome depression, how to deal with anxiety, whatever. So just show that you care, I suppose, would be the main advice.
Yeah, absolutely. So really holding space as well is what I'm kind of getting from that, is listening, maybe empathizing, validating, and not trying to fix it, not trying to be overly positive, just allowing that person to share.
And also, I suppose, don't be afraid to ask that person what what that person needs or wants might not be what we would need or want in that circumstances. And so this goes back to that idea about trying to fix. Some people might want help. They might want practical suggestions. They might want fixes. And if you can offer that, fantastic. But not everyone does, for a variety of reasons. Some people just want you to sit there and either literally or metaphorically hold their hand. And if that's what we can only understand that if we ask that person. So that's a really simple question: is what do you need now? What can I do for you now? In what ways can I help you now? So you don't actually have to know the answer to that. You can ask that person, and hopefully they'll tell you.
Yeah. That's really great advice. For people listening, you've got a new book coming out. Tell us a little bit about what are some of the key insights and takeaways from that.
Well, it's a lot about what we've talked about. I've spent a big part of my life. I suppose I've spent a big part of my life working towards being an expert and trying to help other people with my expertise and my advice. And a lot of that's been helping people strive towards better mental health and happiness, etc. I guess I've known this for a long time, but it became crystallized, a few years ago when I started to realize that I don't really have a fucking clue what's going on. But I've also come to accept that that's okay. And I think this is, so much of our society, excuse the swearing, but so much of our society is, setting goals, working towards goals, finding clarity, knowing who you are, knowing what, a career path, a personal life, married, children, etc., etc. And look, that's not all bad at all. That's fantastic. If you know the answers to all those questions, and if you know, where you want to go, fantastic. But a lot of us, and even if we do, we can get lost on the way. We fail, we stumble, we take a wrong, but we don't talk about. Not enough people talk about those things. I started to realize that I'd taken many, many wrong turns in my life. I've had many failings in my life, and so have most people. So that's what this is really about. It's about failing, but learning from that so you can succeed. It's about accepting misery so you can then become, it's about literally and metaphorically getting lost so you can find what you really want to find or what you never imagined you could find, but it's actually better than you'd ever imagined. So, there's both sort of a literal and metaphorical meaning to that title, which I hope people, I guess it's about vulnerability and acceptance of the sort of some of the key constructs within that.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, the more you understand, the more you learn. You're sort of saying the less clue you've got. That's an interesting paradox.
Well, and if I'd thought about that, or if you'd asked me about that years ago, I would have thought that was a problem. I would have thought not know, and my response would have been study and learn. One of my top strengths is a love of learning, so I would have gone to research and study and learn more about it. But I guess I've come to accept that. I mean, you can't know everything, you can't do everything, and that's okay. So it's okay not to know. It's okay to make mistakes. It's okay to have failings and weaknesses. That's just part of being a human.
Yeah, and it ties in really nicely to everything we've been speaking about is I think not being okay with that and having maybe an unrelenting standard or impossible expectations or this idea that we don't make mistakes can really make it hard for somebody to reach out for help, to lean on loved ones, to take a breath and look after themselves.
Oh, for sure. And so again, within the, again, I share a lot more personal experiences than I ever before, and part of it is sort of reflecting on some of my success. I mean, even so this is my seventh book. I would never have thought that would be, and I've had 11 audio. I still remember writing when my first book was published, thinking it was the most incredible thing in the world, and it was. I was so proud. It was such an achievement. I never thought there'd be so many. But when I think about that and the other, what might appear to be the other successes in my life, almost every one of them has come after or as a result of some failure or some mistake or some stumble or some accident of fate, dare I say. And yet, again, we don't recognize them. So what that means is when we do make mistakes, which we will because we're human, we see that as a bad thing. And then, look, I guess got to be real. Sometimes it is a bad thing. Sometimes mistakes are problematic. But a lot of the time we can learn from them. And there are concepts, there's learning through growth and post-traumatic growth. And there's all sorts of concepts that I refer to. There's philosophical ideas like wabi-sabi that some of your listeners might be familiar with, seeing the beauty in imperfection. I guess it's just trying to bring all of that together and help people understand that if or when you stuff up, maybe that's okay. Maybe some good will come from it. Or how can you make some good come out of that? How can you learn from that to become better or stronger or wiser? Or because that's certainly been the case for me many, many times.
Yeah. So what would be a kind of key takeaway you'd like people to come away from this episode with around maybe happiness or toxic positivity or even kind of just mental health in general?
Well, I think I'd say the genuine happiness is really about accepting ourselves in all of our humanity. It's about accepting all of ourselves. And as humans, as I said, we make mistakes, we stuff up, we get. So if we really want to be genuinely, authentically happy, we need to accept all of life's. You can't have the light without the dark, I suppose. And so that level of acceptance is not something that I gave enough consideration to early on, and it's not something a lot of people do. I think we tend to fight those unpleasant emotions like grief and sadness. We tend to try to push away stress and anxiety, or we use distraction or drugs or alcohol or all sorts of other things. But that doesn't, or not necessarily, it doesn't work in the long term either. So if we really want to have a genuinely good life, we need to accept all of life. And sometimes that's ugly. Sometimes that's, but that's it. So I'm not sure if that was quite as succinct as I would have liked it to have been, but I hope that sums it up for some people out there.
Yeah, I love it. Accept the ugly and the messy. It's very beautiful. Thank you so much for your time today, Tim. People can find your book hopefully very soon after this podcast episode has been released. Wherever they buy books. Is there an audiobook coming out too? Because that's kind of my favourite, is to listen to audio.
Oh, there are. So thanks. I'm not quite sure when this is going to air, but the book will be out on July 2nd, 2020. It should be available in all good bookshops. There's a bit of a special happening at Dimmick, so if anyone's there. But it's also available in Booktopia and hopefully in all bookstores. And yes, there is an audio version. So if you're an author, it'll be available there again on the same date, July 2nd. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for giving a bit of a plug.
Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to kind of hear people share. I love this. It's kind of a unique position to have both the clinical experience and the lived experience. And I think more people do than share it for a variety of reasons, but I think it really helps position what you talk about in a very different way, and people can really relate to that very differently than feeling it's just purely kind of theoretical or academic. So thank you for being vulnerable and putting your stuff out there.
Thanks again for having me.